Some people need to learn their place. The words would echo in Dr. Zara Williams' mind for months afterward. But this morning, as she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Chicago penthouse, watching the sunrise paint the skyline gold, she had no idea that a single flight would change everything she thought she knew about power justice and the price of staying silent. At 38, Zara had built Phoenix Financial Holdings from nothing into a financial empire worth billions, but she still felt like that scared little girl from Detroit every time she walked into rooms where people looked surprised to see her. The mahogany desk behind her held the documents for the biggest deal of her career, a $2.8 billion European acquisition that would cement her company's position in international markets. But first, she had to get to London, and something about this trip felt different in ways she couldn't quite name. Her phone buzzed with the familiar efficiency of her assistant Marcus calling at exactly 6 a.m., just as he had every morning for the past 5 years. "Good morning, Dr. Williams." His voice carried the professional warmth that made him indispensable. "Your car will arrive in 2 hours flight 847 to London, departing at 11:30 first class confirmed in seat 1A. She thanked him and ended the call, then walked to her dresser where a small silver frame held the only photograph that really mattered to her. Her mother, Eleanor Williams, looked back at her from the picture with the kind of quiet strength that had carried their family through years of poverty, discrimination, and doubt. Eleanor had cleaned office buildings at night to pay for Zara's education, never complaining, never asking for recognition, just believing that her daughter could become someone who mattered in a world that often acted like she didn't exist. "Baby girl," Eleanor used to say when young Zara came home crying from school because teachers assumed she wasn't smart enough for advanced classes. "Your worth isn't determined by other people's comfort with your presence." Zara touched the frame gently, drawing strength from a woman who had died 5 years ago, but whose voice still guided every important decision she made. Today's meeting in London would determine whether Phoenix Financial could expand into European markets or remain forever relegated to being a successful but ultimately regional American firm, and the weight of that possibility pressed against her chest like a physical thing. She had learned to dress carefully for meetings like this, choosing clothes that whispered success rather than shouting it, understanding that her presence already made people uncomfortable enough without adding the challenge of obvious wealth to their assumptions about who she was supposed to be. The navy blue suit she selected was perfectly tailored but understated expensive enough to command respect from people who understood quality but subtle enough not to threaten those who preferred their black women to remain safely invisible in rooms where money was discussed. Her jewelry was minimal, her makeup professional, her hair pulled back in a style that couldn't be criticized as unprofessional by people who had never had to worry about whether their appearance would be used as an excuse to dismiss their ideas. As she prepared to leave for the airport, Zara found herself thinking about all the flights she had taken over the past decade, all the times she had been questioned about whether she belonged in first class, all the moments when she had smiled politely and provided extra documentation to prove she had paid for the same treatment that other passengers received automatically. She had learned to carry multiple forms of identification to keep receipts easily accessible, to remain calm when confronted by people who couldn't imagine that someone who looked like her could afford to sit in the front of an airplane. The irony wasn't lost on her that Phoenix Financial Holdings had investments in airline companies, hotel chains, and travel services that generated billions in revenue from customers who often looked exactly like she did, but were routinely treated as if their money was somehow less legitimate than everyone else's. She had built her company partly on the understanding that underserved markets represented massive opportunities for businesses smart enough to treat people with dignity regardless of their appearance. But she had also learned that knowing something intellectually was very different from experiencing it personally. Her driver arrived precisely on time, as everything in Zara's carefully orchestrated life always did, and they made their way through Chicago traffic toward O'Hare Airport while she reviewed notes for her London presentation. The numbers were impressive, even by her own standards. Projections that showed how Phoenix Financial could provide capital and expertise to European firms looking to expand into American markets, creating partnerships that would benefit everyone involved. But she knew that success in international finance required more than good ideas and strong numbers. It required the kind of credibility that people like her had to earn over and over again, while others seemed to inherit it simply by existing in the right bodies with the right backgrounds. As the airport came into view, Zara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied important travel. The awareness that she was about to spend the next several hours in spaces where her right to be there would be quietly but consistently questioned by people who had never learned to see past their own assumptions about who belonged where and why. The first-class lounge at O'Hare buzzed with the subdued energy of business travelers who had paid for the privilege of avoiding crowds, noise, and inconvenience. But Zara Richardson stood at the reception desk feeling like she was asking for something she had no right to request, rather than claiming something she had legitimately purchased. Jennifer Walsh, the lounge manager, looked at her with the kind of polite skepticism that Zara recognized from 1,000 similar encounters, her eyes scanning Zara's boarding pass like she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. "I'm sorry," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness of someone trained to deliver disappointing news gently, "but this lounge is reserved for first-class passengers and Platinum Elite members." She handed back the boarding pass without really looking at it, her attention already shifting toward the door where she expected more appropriate customers to arrive. Jennifer was 35, a single mother who had worked her way up from gate agent to lounge manager through years of careful attention to rules and procedures. But she had also learned that keeping her job meant keeping the right people happy, and experience had taught her to identify those people quickly and accurately. Zara felt the familiar weight of having to prove herself worthy of treatment that other people received without question. But before she could respond, the lounge doors opened with the confident energy of someone who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. Blake Morrison swept into the space like he owned it. His platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, his navy suit cut with the kind of precision that came from generations of inherited wealth, his presence filling the room with the unconscious entitlement of someone who had never been told he didn't belong. "Mr. Morrison." Jennifer's voice transformed instantly, warming with genuine deference as she practically glowed with the attention of a customer she actually wanted to serve. "Welcome back. Your usual table is available and I'll have your scotch sent over immediately." Blake barely acknowledged her enthusiasm, already moving toward his preferred spot, while pulling out his phone to continue a conversation that everyone in the room could hear whether they wanted to or not. "The Morrison Properties deal closes in 6 hours London time," Blake was saying, his voice carrying the satisfied confidence of someone who had never worried about whether his business would succeed, because failure had never been presented to him as a realistic possibility. 900 million in financing, all secured through the European Consortium, and by tomorrow I'll control the largest commercial real estate portfolio in 3 countries. He gestured expansively with his crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the light as he painted himself as a financial mastermind to whoever was unfortunate enough to be listening. Zara remained at the reception desk watching this performance while Jennifer pretended to be busy with paperwork rather than addressing the fact that she had just denied service to a paying customer based on assumptions that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with prejudice. Blake's conversation continued, growing louder and more boastful as the alcohol took effect, his words revealing someone who confused inherited access with earned achievement, who believed that his comfort mattered more than other people's dignity. "The European banks don't understand leverage the way Americans do." Blake continued, laughing at his own perceived cleverness. Old-world thinking conservative approaches they're about to learn what real capital can accomplish when it's managed by someone who understands how to use power effectively. He paused to take another drink, then noticed Zara still standing at the reception desk, her presence apparently registering as some kind of disruption to the natural order of things. "Excuse me," Blake said, his voice cutting across the lounge with the casual authority of someone addressing a service problem. "Is there some kind of issue here that needs to be resolved?" He looked directly at Zara with undisguised annoyance, as if her continued presence was somehow interfering with his ability to enjoy the space he considered his personal domain. Jennifer flushed with embarrassment caught between her desire to please her most important customer and her growing awareness that she might have made a mistake that could create complications. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison," Jennifer said quickly. "There seems to be some confusion about lounge access, but I'm handling it." She turned back to Zara with an expression that mixed apology with desperation, clearly hoping that this situation could be resolved quietly before it attracted more attention from other customers who might judge her competence based on her ability to maintain the lounge's exclusive atmosphere. Zara looked between them, understanding exactly what was happening and why recognizing the familiar pattern of assumptions that had shaped too many encounters throughout her life. She could accept the business-class lounge down the hall, smile graciously, and avoid creating the kind of scene that would make everyone uncomfortable, or she could insist on receiving the service she had paid for and risk being labeled as difficult, aggressive, or unreasonable by people who had never had to fight for basic dignity. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Zara said calmly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned that polite persistence often succeeded where anger failed. "I have a confirmed first-class ticket, and I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the lounge access policy." She maintained eye contact with Jennifer, letting her know that this wasn't going to be resolved by hoping the problem would go away on its own. Blake Morrison laughed, a sound that carried no humor but plenty of contempt. "Lady, this isn't the kind of place where you can talk your way into service you haven't paid for." He said his words, hitting the lounge like cold water thrown on a pleasant conversation. "Some people need to learn their place, and first class, isn't it?" The statement hung in the air between them, ugly and unmistakable, transforming what might have been dismissed as a simple misunderstanding into something much more revealing and dangerous. Flight 847 to London sat at the jetway like a sleeping giant, its Boeing 777 frame gleaming under the terminal lights, while passengers queued for boarding with the tired patience of people who traveled frequently enough to know that complaining about delays only made them longer. Zara Williams walked down the jetway with her boarding pass clutched in steady fingers, trying to push Blake Morrison's words out of her mind and focus on the meetings waiting for her in London. But something about his casual cruelty had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter that wouldn't stop aching. The first-class cabin welcomed her with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted cream-colored leather seats, arranged like private suites, polished wood panels that caught the soft lighting and crystal glasses that sparkled like jewelry in their holders. Seat 1. A was supposed to be hers, the window seat she had specifically requested when booking this flight 3 weeks ago. But as she approached her row, she found it occupied by the last person she wanted to see. Blake Morrison had made himself completely at home in her assigned seat, his jacket draped over the ottoman. His shoes kicked off a glass of champagne already in his hand as he continued the loud phone conversation that had annoyed everyone in the departure lounge. When he noticed Zara approaching, his eyes flicked over her with the same dismissive assessment she had received at the lounge reception desk, then returned to his call without the slightest indication that he intended to move. "Excuse me," Zara said, stopping at the entrance to what should have been her suite, her voice carrying the professional courtesy she had learned to use when addressing people who held power over situations she couldn't control. "You're in my seat." She held up her boarding pass, the seat assignment clearly visible, but Blake barely glanced at it before waving his hand dismissively like he was shooing away an annoying insect. "The crew will sort out whatever confusion this is," Blake replied, his tone suggesting that her presence was a minor inconvenience that someone else would handle appropriately. "Find an open seat somewhere and let the professionals figure out the paperwork." He returned to his phone conversation as if the matter was settled, as if his comfort and convenience automatically trumped any claim she might have to the space she had legitimately purchased. Rachel Stevens appeared in the aisle with the bright smile and efficient movements of a flight attendant who had been trained to diffuse conflicts before they disrupted the cabin's carefully maintained atmosphere. She was 29, ambitious, hard-working, and desperately hoping for a promotion that would depend partly on her ability to handle difficult situations without creating complaints or delays that reflected poorly on her performance evaluations. "Is there a problem here?" Rachel asked, her voice warm but with an undertone that suggested she had already decided who was causing the disruption and who deserved her support. She looked between Zara and Blake with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to identify the passengers most likely to complain to corporate management if their experience was anything less than perfect. "No problem at all," Blake said confidently, settling deeper into the seat with the satisfied air of someone whose position was unassailable. "Just a seating mix-up that I'm sure you can resolve quickly and efficiently." He gestured toward Zara with his champagne glass, the crystal catching the cabin light as he continued. "I'm sure there's space available in business class, maybe even an upgrade from whatever she originally paid for." Rachel turned to Zara with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely concealed impatience, clearly hoping this situation could be resolved with minimal fuss and maximum speed. "Ma'am, if I could see your boarding pass, I'd be happy to help you find your correct seat," she said, extending her hand with the kind of smile that people practiced in training seminars about customer service recovery. Zara handed over her documents, watching Rachel's expression falter slightly as she read the seat assignment that clearly showed 1A, then watched her recovery as training kicked in, and she began looking for ways to accommodate the passenger who seemed most likely to cause problems if his demands weren't met immediately and completely. "This does show seat 1. Rachel admitted reluctantly. "But Mr. Morrison is one of our most valued customers, and I'm sure we can find you something equally comfortable in our business class cabin." She gestured toward the back of the plane with the practiced enthusiasm of someone trying to sell disappointment as an upgrade, her voice taking on the artificially cheerful tone that customer service representatives used when they needed people to accept less than what they had paid for. Blake Morrison laughed, a sound that carried the ugly confidence of someone who had never been told that his comfort didn't matter more than everyone else's dignity. "Look," he said, his voice taking on the patient condescension of an adult explaining reality to a slow child. "I don't know how you ended up with a first-class ticket, but this is where I always sit when I fly this route, and frankly, some people need to learn their place." The words hit the first-class cabin like a physical blow, causing other passengers to look up from their phones and magazines with the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something that couldn't be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding. Blake's statement hung in the air between them, naked and unmistakable, transforming what might have been resolved as a booking error into something much more revealing about character prejudice and the assumptions that shaped how people moved through the world. Zara felt every eye in the cabin turn toward her, felt the familiar weight of being put on trial in a courtroom where the jury had already decided her guilt based on nothing more than appearance and other people's comfort with their own biases. She could accept the business class seat smile graciously and avoid creating the kind of scene that would make everyone uncomfortable, or she could fight for the dignity and equality she had already purchased with her own money. For the first time in years, she chose to fight. The business class cabin felt like exile as Zara Williams settled into seat 4B, her carry-on placed with careful precision in the overhead compartment, while the sounds of Blake Morrison's continued phone conversation drifted back from first class like smoke from a fire she couldn't escape. She pulled out her phone with steady fingers that didn't reveal the storm building inside her chest, scrolling to a contact she rarely used for personal matters. But this had moved far beyond personal territory into something that required the kind of response that only institutional power could provide. David Rodriguez answered on the second ring with the crisp efficiency of someone who understood that calls from his CEO at unusual hours meant important decisions were about to be made. Phoenix Financial. "David speaking," he said, his voice carrying the alert attention of a former federal banking regulator who had learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when seemingly small problems were about to become very large complications. "David, it's Zara," she said, keeping her voice low enough that other passengers couldn't overhear the conversation that was about to reshape someone's entire life. "I need you to run a complete financial exposure analysis on Morrison Properties and any associated entities, particularly their European acquisition financing, and I need it immediately." There was a pause on the other end of the line, not confusion, but the kind of focused attention that came from understanding that his boss didn't make requests like this unless something significant had happened. "What's the time frame?" David asked, and Zara could hear keyboard clicks beginning in the background as he started pulling up financial databases and cross-referencing systems that would reveal the complex web of relationships connecting major international deals. "I need to understand our risk exposure to Blake Morrison's business operations, and I need that information in the next 10 minutes, she replied, glancing toward the first-class cabin where Blake's voice continued to carry his boastful confidence to anyone within earshot. The analysis took exactly 8 minutes, and when David called back, his voice carried the particular tone of someone who had discovered information that would rearrange multiple people's understanding of power consequence and the hidden connections that made modern financial markets function. "This is fascinating from a risk management perspective," David said carefully, using the precise language of someone who had learned that explosive information required delicate handling. "Morrison Properties is leveraged to the absolute maximum on this European acquisition." David continued his words, painting a picture of financial architecture held together by confidence and credit, rather than actual stability. $900 million in bridge financing, all of it structured through European banking consortiums. But the underlying risk guarantees flow through shell companies and subsidiary arrangements that ultimately trace back to Phoenix Financial Holdings. Zara closed her eyes, feeling the pieces of Blake Morrison's financial empire arrange themselves in her mind like a puzzle she had been unconsciously solving for years. Her company had grown large enough and diversified enough that she couldn't track every investment, every guarantee, every web of relationships that connected her business interests to deals across multiple continents. But David's explanation revealed that Blake's entire European expansion depended on financial backing that she ultimately controlled. Specifically, David said, his keyboard still clicking as he pulled up additional layers of documentation. Phoenix International Risk Management, which is a wholly owned subsidiary that we use for high-risk international loan guarantees, is carrying the ultimate liability for Morrison Properties bridge financing, which means if we invoke the behavioral standards clause, the entire deal collapses immediately and completely. The behavioral standards clause was something Phoenix Financial had pioneered in international lending, a provision that allowed them to withdraw support from deals if borrowers engaged in conduct that could damage the reputation of associated financial institutions. It was rarely used, designed more as insurance than as a weapon, but it existed for exactly these situations where someone's character flaws threatened the integrity of business relationships built on trust and mutual respect. Zara thought about her mother's photograph sitting on her dresser in Chicago, about Eleanor Williams cleaning office buildings at night so her daughter could attend schools where teachers assumed she didn't belong, about all the times she had remained silent when faced with discrimination because fighting seemed too expensive and complicated. "David," she said, her voice taking on the quiet authority that her employees had learned to recognize as the signal that important decisions were being made, "I want you to initiate an immediate review of our risk exposure to Morrison Properties based on behavioral standards violations. The consequences would be severe," David warned, though his tone suggested he understood exactly why Zara was making this choice. Complete financial collapse, bankruptcy proceedings, personal liability for failed acquisition costs, probably around $200 million in total losses when you factor in penalties and legal fees. He paused, letting the magnitude of the destruction settle between them, then added, "This would effectively end Blake Morrison's career in international real estate." Zara looked toward the first-class cabin where Blake continued his phone conversation, oblivious to the fact that his casual cruelty was about to cost him everything he had spent decades building. "Mr. Morrison just told me that some people need to learn their place," she said quietly. "I think it's time he learned what happens when people in positions of authority demonstrate that their judgment cannot be trusted with other people's money." The authorization took less than 3 minutes to process. Financial markets moved at the speed of light When properly motivated and somewhere in the complex network of international banking relationships, computer systems began updating account statuses and freezing access to funds that Blake Morrison was counting on to close the biggest deal of his career. David confirmed the transaction with the calm efficiency of someone executing routine business procedures, though they both understood that nothing about this situation was routine. Bridge loan frozen pending behavioral compliance review, David reported. European banks will be notified within the hour. Legal documentation is being prepared, and the Swiss banking consortium will receive official notice that Phoenix Financial is withdrawing support for the Morrison Properties acquisition, effective immediately. He paused, then added with something that might have been satisfaction, Mr. Morrison should start receiving phone calls in approximately 15 minutes. Zara ended the call and tucked her phone into her purse, feeling the weight of what she had just set in motion settling around her like a cloak she couldn't remove. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying, justified and potentially excessive, necessary and dangerous in ways that wouldn't become clear until the consequences had finished playing out completely. She had finally used her power to enforce the principle that dignity couldn't be purchased at any price, but the cost of that enforcement was about to be measured in the complete destruction of another human being's life and career. From the first-class cabin, Blake Morrison's voice continued its confident boasting, completely unaware that his financial empire was already beginning to crumble in real time, that phone calls were being made and documents were being filed that would transform him from wealthy real estate mogul to bankrupt defendant before this flight reached London. Zara settled back in her seat and waited for justice to reveal itself in the most expensive lesson about assumptions that Blake Morrison would ever receive. The change in Blake Morrison's voice was immediate and visceral, transforming from confident boasting to something approaching panic in the space between heartbeats, and Zara Williams could track the exact moment when his carefully constructed world began collapsing through the shift in tone that carried back from the first-class cabin like the sound of breaking glass. She remained perfectly still in seat 4B, her eyes closed as if resting, while sounds from 3 rows ahead painted a precise picture of a man discovering that assumptions could be very expensive mistakes. "Run that again." Blake's voice cut through the aircraft's ambient noise, sharp with the kind of disbelief that came from hearing information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his own financial situation. "That's impossible. I've been banking with Deutsche Bank for 15 years. My credit rating is perfect. There has to be some kind of computer error." His tone still carried traces of the authority he was accustomed to wielding, but uncertainty had begun creeping in around the edges like water finding cracks in a foundation. Zara heard the distinctive sound of rapid dialing, followed by Blake's voice taking on the carefully controlled patience of someone trying to manage a crisis without admitting that a crisis existed. "Patricia, it's Blake. I need you to call Jonathan at the New York office immediately and find out why our wire transfer was declined." He said his words coming faster now as the implications of blocked funding began penetrating his alcohol-fogged understanding of cause and effect. Other first-class passengers had begun to notice the disruption, their conversations dying mid-sentence as Blake's voice rose with increasing desperation, and his gestures became more animated. Champagne sloshing in his crystal glass as he waved his free hand like he was conducting an orchestra of outrage that no one else could hear. The carefully maintained atmosphere of expensive calm that first-class cabins were designed to provide had been shattered by the reality that money couldn't solve problems that money had created. "What do you mean? Compliance review?" Blake's voice cracked on the words, revealing someone who had never experienced having his financial decisions questioned by institutions that had previously treated him as an unquestionable authority on his own business affairs. "There's nothing to review. Everything was approved months ago. The documentation is perfect. Someone is deliberately sabotaging this deal, and I want to know who, and I want to know why." Rachel Stevens appeared in the aisle again, her professional smile strained as she tried to manage a situation that was rapidly moving beyond the scope of her training in customer service recovery. "Sir," she said carefully, Other passengers are trying to rest and will be taking off soon, so if you could keep your voice down, it would be much appreciated." Blake looked at her with the kind of wild-eyed desperation of someone whose entire identity was being challenged by forces he couldn't see or control. "Don't tell me to keep my voice down." Blake snapped his composure, completely shattered now as the reality of frozen accounts and blocked transfers began reshaping his understanding of his own power and position. "I'm losing $900 million. My entire European expansion is being destroyed by some kind of corporate conspiracy, and you're worried about noise levels." His voice had climbed to a pitch that carried throughout the aircraft, causing passengers in business and economy class to look up from their books and phones with the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing someone's complete financial meltdown. The phone rang again, and Blake answered it with the desperate speed of someone hoping for good news but expecting catastrophe. "What do you mean she filed for divorce?" he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed louder than his previous shouting. "Patricia, we talked about this. We agreed that our personal assets would be protected if there were business complications. You can't just abandon 20 years of marriage because of one bad day." Zara opened her eyes slightly and saw Blake's reflection in the window, noting how completely his physical posture had changed from the confident swagger he had displayed during boarding to something that looked like a man who had been physically struck by invisible blows. Flushed with alcohol and panic as he tried to get the door open. Flushed with alcohol and panic as he tried to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about security, stability, and his own invulnerability. "The house is in foreclosure proceedings." Blake's voice rose again, drawing disapproving looks from passengers who had paid premium prices to avoid exactly this kind of disruption to their travel experience. "How is that possible? The mortgage payments are automatic. They're drawn from the main business account. There has to be some kind of mistake." But even as he spoke the words, Zara could hear him beginning to understand that individual mistakes didn't create the kind of comprehensive financial collapse he was experiencing. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled over the intercom with the calm authority of someone trained to maintain control in crisis situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay for some final paperwork, but we expect to be airborne within the next few minutes," he announced. Though Zara suspected the delay had more to do with Blake's increasingly erratic behavior than with any administrative requirements. Blake made another call, his fingers shaking slightly as he dialed numbers that he had probably memorized years ago but now seemed to require tremendous concentration to remember correctly. "Richard. Thank God you answered," he said, his voice taking on the desperate politeness of someone whose survival depended on other people's willingness to help him. "Something terrible is happening. All of our accounts are frozen. The European deal is falling apart. My wife has filed for divorce and I'm trapped on an airplane with no way to fix any of it." Zara couldn't hear the response, but Blake's face told the story of someone receiving news that made his situation even worse than he had imagined possible. "What do you mean you're resigning as my attorney?" Blake asked, his voice breaking on the question. "We've worked together for 12 years. You handled my father's estate. You know my family. You can't just abandon me when I need you most." The conversation ended with Blake staring at his phone like it had transformed into something he didn't recognize, and Zara realized that she was witnessing the moment when someone's entire support system collapsed simultaneously, when the people who had surrounded him during good times revealed their true loyalty by disappearing. The instant loyalty became inconvenient or expensive. Blake's next call went straight to voicemail, as did the one after that, and the one after that, creating a pattern that painted a picture of complete social and professional isolation that was almost as devastating as the financial destruction. Zara watched his reflection in the window as he scrolled through his contacts with increasing desperation, looking for someone, anyone who might be willing to take his call and help him understand how his life had disintegrated so completely and so quickly. "This can't be happening," Blake muttered to himself, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the first-class cabin's engineered quiet. 6 hours ago, I was closing the biggest deal of my career. Now everything is gone, and I don't even understand why." Zara felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy quickly suppressed by the memory of his casual cruelty and the understanding that consequences, even severe ones, were sometimes the only way people learned that their actions affected other human beings. Captain Mitchell appeared in the first-class cabin with the measured steps of someone who had decided that a situation required personal intervention rather than delegation to crew members who were already overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their training. He was a veteran pilot in his 50s, someone who had learned to read passenger behavior like weather patterns. Understanding that certain combinations of stress, alcohol, and entitlement could create turbulence that was more dangerous than anything nature could produce at 30,000 feet. "Mr. Morrison." Captain Mitchell said, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from decades of managing crises in confined spaces where panic could spread faster than fire. "I'm going to need you to end your phone calls and explain to me why you've been disrupting this flight." Blake looked up at him with wild eyes, his face flushed with desperation and disbelief, clearly struggling to process that his problems had grown large enough to attract attention from the aircraft's commanding officer. "Captain Blake said," and Zara could hear him trying to summon his old confidence, the voice he used in board meetings and business negotiations when he needed people to understand that he was someone whose demands deserved immediate attention. "There's been a terrible mistake, some kind of corporate sabotage that's destroying my business while I'm trapped on this airplane. I need to return to Chicago immediately to resolve this crisis before it gets worse." Captain Mitchell had been flying commercial aircraft for 28 years, long enough to distinguish between genuine emergencies and personal problems that felt like emergencies to the people experiencing them. "Sir," he replied with the patience of someone accustomed to managing difficult passengers, "I understand you're dealing with business difficulties, but once we're airborne, we proceed to our destination, unless there's a genuine safety emergency and financial problems. However serious, don't qualify for flight diversions." Blake's laugh was bitter and desperate. "Financial problems." He repeated, his voice rising again despite the captain's presence. "I'm not talking about financial problems. I'm talking about the complete destruction of everything I've built over the past 20 years, $900 million disappearing without explanation, and you're treating this like some kind of routine customer service issue." Captain Mitchell glanced around the first-class cabin, noting the way other passengers had stopped pretending not to listen to Blake's increasingly erratic behavior, then looked down at the passenger manifest he had brought with him. "Mr. Morrison," he said carefully, "I've been reviewing our passenger list and I need to ask you some questions about the incident that occurred during boarding." What incident? Blake's voice climbed toward defensiveness, though something in the captain's tone suggested that he already knew more about the situation than Blake had realized. "If you're talking about the seating confusion that was resolved appropriately, I handled it exactly the way any experienced traveler would handle someone trying to claim a seat they hadn't paid for." Captain Mitchell's expression hardened slightly, the change subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood how authority actually worked when it was backed by responsibility rather than just privilege. According to the crew report, the captain continued, "You refused to show your boarding pass when requested, made disparaging comments about another passenger, and told her that some people need to learn their place." The words hung in the first-class cabin like an accusation that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, and Blake's face went through a series of expressions that revealed someone beginning to understand that his casual cruelty might have consequences beyond the immediate satisfaction of putting someone he considered inferior in what he thought was her proper place. She was using questionable documentation. Blake insisted, but his voice had lost its combative edge, replaced by something that sounded like a man beginning to suspect that he had made a mistake whose dimensions he didn't yet fully comprehend. "I've been flying first class for decades. I know who belongs there and who doesn't, and frankly, someone needed to address the situation before it became a bigger problem." Captain Mitchell turned and walked toward the business class cabin, his footsteps measured and deliberate. and Zara realized that whatever was about to happen would fundamentally change the dynamic between her and Blake Morrison in ways that couldn't be undone or ignored. She heard him approaching her seat and opened her eyes to find him standing in the aisle with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with something that looked like embarrassment on behalf of his airline and his industry. Dr. Williams, Captain Mitchell said, and the use of her professional title immediately changed the atmosphere of their interaction in ways that made other passengers pay attention with the kind of focused interest that came from recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received during boarding, and I need to inform you of some information that's relevant to this situation. Zara looked up at him calmly, though her heart was beating faster as she prepared for whatever revelation was about to transform her conflict with Blake Morrison from a personal discrimination incident into something much larger and more complicated. "Captain," she replied, her voice carrying the steady authority of someone who had learned to remain composed when other people's assumptions about her were about to be challenged by reality. "Dr. Williams." Captain Mitchell continued consulting his passenger manifest. "I want you to know that Phoenix Financial Holdings is the majority stakeholder in the leasing consortium that owns this aircraft." The words landed in the business class cabin like a physical impact, and Zara heard Blake Morrison's sharp intake of breath from 3 rows ahead, followed by complete silence as the implications began penetrating his panic-fogged understanding of power ownership and consequence. "I am aware of that," Zara said simply, her voice carrying across the cabin with quiet authority that made every passenger within hearing distance understand that they were witnessing a revelation that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the conflict they had been observing. Captain Mitchell straightened slightly, his expression shifting to something that looked like professional concern, mixed with the kind of respect that came from suddenly understanding who he was actually talking to. "Dr. Williams," Captain Mitchell said, his voice now carrying the formal courtesy reserved for passengers whose complaints could affect corporate policies and employment decisions on behalf of the airline, the crew, and everyone associated with this flight. "I want to apologize for the completely unacceptable treatment you received, and I want to assure you that there will be consequences for everyone who participated in discriminating against you." From the first-class cabin came a sound that might have been Blake Morrison choking on his champagne, followed by desperate whispers as he tried to process the information that the woman he had dismissed as someone who didn't belong in first class was actually the person whose company owned the airplane they were sitting in, whose financial decisions could make or break deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Captain Zara said, standing with smooth grace and gathering her carry-on bag, "I believe it's time for me to return to my assigned seat." She walked past Blake Morrison's row without looking at him, but she could feel his stare boring into her back as he began to understand that his assumptions about power, place, and privilege had just been revealed as not only wrong, but catastrophically expensive in ways that would reshape the rest of his life. The first-class cabin fell into the kind of silence that followed explosions, a stunned quiet that seemed to amplify every small sound as Zara Williams settled into seat 1A with the calm precision of someone reclaiming what had always belonged to her. Blake Morrison sat frozen in the seat Rachel Stevens had hastily found for him. 3 rows back, his face cycling through expressions of horror, disbelief, and dawning comprehension as the full scope of his mistake became impossible to ignore or minimize. "You," Blake said, finally, his voice barely a whisper, but carrying clearly in the cabin's engineered quiet. "You did this to me." It wasn't a question, but a statement of recognition, the moment when someone who had spent his entire life believing that consequences were things that happened to other people realized that his casual cruelty had just cost him everything he had spent decades building. Zara turned in her seat to look at him directly for the first time since the revelation of her identity had transformed their entire dynamic. "I did nothing to you, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made other passengers pay attention with the focused interest of people witnessing justice unfold in real time. You did this to yourself when you decided that your comfort mattered more than my dignity." Blake's phone buzzed with incoming calls that he no longer seemed capable of answering, the sounds of his collapsing empire demanding attention that he couldn't provide, while grappling with the realization that the woman he had told to learn her place was the same woman who controlled the financial mechanisms that had been supporting his business for months without his knowledge or gratitude. Captain Mitchell returned to make an announcement that carried undertones of satisfaction mixed with professional disappointment. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff, and I want to personally assure all our passengers that this airline is committed to providing equal treatment and respect to everyone who travels with us," he said, his words carefully chosen to acknowledge what had happened without explicitly naming the discrimination that had occurred in his first-class cabin. As the aircraft lifted off from Chicago, Zara felt the familiar sensation of leaving solid ground behind. But this time it carried symbolic weight that went beyond the physics of flight. She was traveling toward London meetings that would determine the future of her company's European expansion. But she was also traveling away from a version of herself that had accepted unequal treatment for the sake of avoiding conflict, and that transformation felt more significant than any business deal she might close. Her phone buzzed with a text message from David Rodriguez that painted a picture of comprehensive financial destruction unfolding in real time. "European Consortium has officially withdrawn from Morrison Properties," the message read, "estimated losses approaching $200 million when penalties and legal fees are factored in bankruptcy proceedings expected within 48 hours. Zara closed her phone and looked out the window at clouds that stretched endlessly in every direction, white and clean and indifferent to the human drama playing out inside the aircraft. She thought about her mother's photograph sitting on her dresser in Chicago, about Eleanor Williams, who had cleaned office buildings at night so her daughter could sit in first-class airplane seats without having to justify her presence to people who had never earned the right to question her. Blake Morrison's voice carried from behind her, smaller now and desperate, as he tried to explain to someone on the phone how his life had disintegrated so completely and so quickly. "She's the CEO of Phoenix Financial," he was saying, his words revealing someone who was finally beginning to understand the web of relationships that connected his business success to the woman he had casually insulted. "I didn't know who she was, but that doesn't matter now because she's destroying everything I've built, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." Zara felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease as she listened to Blake's panic, understanding that justice didn't always feel as clean and simple as she had hoped it would when she was imagining how discrimination should be punished. She had used her power to enforce consequences for behavior that deserved consequences. But the scale of Blake's destruction was almost too complete, too devastating, too absolute in ways that made her question whether she had crossed some line between appropriate response and excessive revenge. The flight attendant approached her seat with champagne and apologies. Her manner transformed from skeptical authority to deferential service in ways that highlighted how completely the power dynamics had shifted since takeoff. Zara accepted the drink but declined the attention, preferring to spend the flight in quiet reflection about power justice and the responsibility that came with having the ability to reshape other people's lives with a single phone call. 6 weeks after Flight 847 landed in London, Zara Williams sat in a wood-paneled conference room in the Hart Senate office building, facing a panel of senators who understood that her airplane encounter with Blake Morrison had become something larger than a personal discrimination incident, evolving into a case study that would influence how financial markets handled behavioral risks and corporate accountability for decades to come. Senator Patricia Murray of Washington leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who recognized that today's testimony would likely reshape policy discussions about discrimination, market regulation, and the intersection of civil rights and economic power. "Dr. Williams," she began, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that congressional hearings demanded. "Your response to discrimination was unusually swift and decisive compared to traditional legal remedies, which can take years to provide. Justice. Can you explain how market-based accountability might be more effective than litigation?" Zara had spent weeks preparing for this moment, understanding that her answers would influence not just academic discussions, but actual policy decisions that affected millions of people who faced discrimination in industries where reputation and trust formed the foundation of trillion-dollar relationships. "Senator Murray," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "Traditional legal remedies are important, but they often provide justice after damage has already been done to people's careers, dignity, and economic opportunities, while financial markets respond to reputational risks in real time, creating immediate consequences for behavior that threatens market stability and consumer confidence." The hearing room buzzed with the particular energy that accompanied congressional sessions on topics that had captured public attention, and Zara could feel the weight of cameras and reporters documenting testimony that would be analyzed, quoted, and referenced in business schools and law schools for years to come. She had never intended to become a public figure, but Blake Morrison's casual cruelty had forced her into a spotlight that came with both opportunities and responsibilities she was still learning to navigate. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts nodded approvingly as Zara explained how discrimination wasn't just morally wrong but economically inefficient, creating market distortions that could be measured, managed, and priced like any other business risk. When companies exclude qualified people because of prejudice, Zara continued, when financial institutions mistreat customers based on assumptions rather than merit, entire markets underperform because decisions are based on bias rather than data. The questions continued for 3 hours, covering regulatory frameworks, market mechanisms, and the role of individual accountability in creating change that extended beyond single incidents to address patterns of discrimination that had been tolerated for decades because the people affected lacked the power to enforce consequences. Zara found herself articulating ideas that had been forming in her mind since that moment on the airplane when she decided to stop accepting unequal treatment as the price of avoiding conflict. After the hearing ended, Zara walked through corridors lined with portraits of legislators who had shaped American policy for over 2 centuries, thinking about how individual moments of courage or cowardice could create ripple effects that influenced entire industries and social structures. Her phone buzzed with messages from reporters, policy advocates, and business representatives who wanted to discuss implementation strategies for accountability systems that could operate at the speed of modern financial markets. But the message that mattered most came from Jennifer Walsh, the lounge manager who had initially denied Zara access to the first-class lounge based on assumptions that had cost her job and forced her to confront her own complicity in discrimination that she had never questioned until it became too expensive to ignore. Dr. Williams. The message read, "I wanted you to know that I've completed sensitivity training and found work with an organization that provides services to underserved communities. Thank you for helping me understand that treating people fairly isn't just morally right, it's also good business." The responses to Zara's congressional testimony had been swift and comprehensive, with 3 major airlines announcing new training protocols for customer-facing staff, financial regulators requiring institutions to measure and report discrimination risks, and business schools adding courses on how prejudice created inefficiencies that could be eliminated through better accountability systems. Blake Morrison had become a case study in how assumptions could destroy careers, but more importantly, the incident had created frameworks that helped entire industries understand the hidden costs of prejudice and the competitive advantages of genuine equality. Blake Morrison entered the conference room at Phoenix Financial Holdings with the careful movements of someone who was no longer certain of his welcome anywhere. His appearance transformed by 6 months of financial ruin, legal battles, and the particular exhaustion that came from losing everything and having to rebuild an identity from nothing but regret and hard-won understanding of consequences. He wore a suit that looked expensive from a distance but showed signs of wear when examined closely, the kind of clothing that suggested someone maintaining appearances on a budget that no longer supported the lifestyle those appearances were meant to convey. His platinum hair had grown out to reveal gray roots that he could no longer afford to maintain, and his face carried lines that spoke of sleepless nights and the crushing weight of complete financial collapse. "Doctor," Williams Blake said, his voice carrying none of the entitled confidence that had characterized their first meeting. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you have no obligation to give me any of your time, and I'm grateful that you're willing to listen to what I need to say." Zara remained standing behind her desk, studying his face for signs of the arrogance and casual cruelty that had defined their airplane encounter. But what she saw instead was something that looked like genuine remorse, mixed with the hollow exhaustion of someone who had been forced to confront the person he had been and didn't like what he had discovered. Blake reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, placing it on Zara's desk with the reverent care of someone handling a document that represented months of soul-searching and self-examination. "I've written you a letter," he said. "Not a business proposal, not a request for money, but an apology. A real one that tries to explain what I've learned about myself and about the harm I caused you, and probably countless other people over the years." Zara glanced at the paper but didn't pick it up immediately, letting silence do the work that words couldn't accomplish while she evaluated whether Blake's transformation was genuine rehabilitation or strategic performance designed to manipulate sympathy from someone whose forgiveness might translate into financial assistance or career opportunities. "Dr. Williams." Blake continued, his voice steady but quiet. "I want you to understand that I know exactly what I did wrong. It wasn't just that I didn't recognize who you were, though that was part of it. It was that I didn't think it mattered who you were, because I assumed my comfort and convenience were more important than your dignity and basic human respect." He paused, looking directly at her with eyes that showed none of the dismissive assessment she remembered from their first encounter. "I've spent the past 6 months learning what it feels like to be dismissed by people who make assumptions about your worth based on your appearance, to be told you don't belong in places you used to take for granted, to have your credibility questioned and your character judged by strangers who think they understand your story better than you do." Zara picked up the letter and scanned its contents, noting handwriting that was careful and deliberate words, chosen with the precision of someone who had spent months thinking about accountability, redemption, and the difference between consequences and punishment. The letter didn't ask for anything except understanding, didn't make excuses or shift blame, didn't minimize the harm that had been caused, or suggest that time should heal wounds that required active repair rather than passive forgetting. "What do you want from me, Mr. Morrison?" Zara asked, her tone neutral but not hostile, curious about whether Blake had learned to distinguish between making amends and seeking advantages from people he had wronged. Blake straightened slightly, seeming to gather courage for whatever request he was about to make that would reveal whether his apparent transformation was genuine change or sophisticated manipulation. "I want to work for you," he said simply, the words landing in the conference room with quiet sincerity that suggested someone who had learned the difference between asking for charity and earning opportunities through demonstrated commitment to becoming a better person than he had been when power and privilege had insulated him from the consequences of treating other human beings as obstacles to his comfort, rather than individuals deserving of basic respect and dignity. The community center in Queens buzzed with the energy of evening classes as Blake Morrison stood before a group of recent immigrants, his voice patient and encouraging as he explained basic financial literacy concepts to people who had come to America with dreams that required understanding systems designed to exclude them. His appearance had changed dramatically over the past year. Gray hair now worn naturally expensive suits replaced by casual clothes, appropriate for someone whose job involved serving others rather than being served by them. "Building credit in America is like learning a new language," Blake was saying to his students, his tone carrying none of the condescending authority that had once characterized his business interactions. "It requires patience, consistency, and understanding that the system wasn't designed with people like us in mind. But that doesn't mean we can't master it and use it to build the lives we want for our families." Maria Gonzalez, a woman from Guatemala who cleaned office buildings at night to support her 3 children, raised her hand with the hesitant politeness of someone who had learned that questions could be dangerous if asked to the wrong people at the wrong time. "Mr. Blake," she said, using the name he had asked all his students to call him. How do we know which banks will treat us fairly when we don't look like the people in their advertisements? Blake's answer came from hard-earned experience rather than theoretical knowledge. That's an excellent question, Maria, and the honest answer is that discrimination still exists in financial services, but there are ways to protect yourself by documenting everything, bringing witnesses when possible, and understanding that your money is just as valuable as anyone else's, regardless of what assumptions people might make about you. After the class ended, Blake walked home to his studio apartment with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had found purpose in work that mattered rather than simply work that paid well. The apartment was small, furnished with second-hand pieces that he had learned to appreciate for their function rather than their status value. But it felt more like home than the mansion in Connecticut that had been foreclosed 8 months earlier. He sat at his simple desk and pulled out stationery for his monthly letter to Dr. Zara Williams, a practice he had maintained not because he expected responses, but because accountability required consistent acknowledgement of harm caused and progress made toward becoming someone who deserved the second chance he had been given. Dear Dr. Williams, he wrote, his handwriting careful and deliberate. This month I wanted to tell you about Maria, one of my students who just opened her first bank account after years of being paid in cash and keeping her savings hidden under her mattress because she was afraid that banks wouldn't serve someone like her. He paused, thinking about how to explain the connection between his current work and the lesson she had taught him about power responsibility and the difference between using privilege to exclude others and using experience to include them. I understand now that what you did to me wasn't revenge. Blake continued writing. It was education delivered through consequences, the kind of teaching that only happens when people who have been comfortable with causing harm finally experience what that harm feels like. He had learned to write these letters without asking for forgiveness or seeking absolution, understanding that redemption was something he had to earn through consistent actions rather than eloquent words. The letter, like all the others, would be mailed without expectation of response, but Blake had learned that the value of accountability didn't depend on acknowledgement from the people he had wronged, only on his commitment to becoming someone who used his experience to prevent others from making the same mistakes he had made, when power and privilege had insulated him from understanding the human cost of casual cruelty. Outside his window, Queens spread out in all directions, a borough filled with people building lives from nothing. People who understood that dignity wasn't something that could be granted or taken away by others, but something that had to be claimed and defended through daily choices about how to treat other human beings with respect, fairness, and recognition of shared humanity. The cemetery in Detroit was quiet, except for the sound of wind moving through autumn leaves as Dr. Zara Williams knelt beside her mother's headstone, placing fresh flowers on Eleanor Williams's grave, while thinking about power justice and the difference between winning battles and creating lasting change that honored the sacrifice of people who had fought similar fights without the resources to enforce consequences for discrimination they had endured. Mama Zara said softly, her voice carrying across the peaceful space where her mother rested among others who had worked and struggled and dreamed of a world where their children wouldn't have to prove their worth to people who had never earned the right to question their dignity. I think you would be proud of what happened, not because I destroyed someone's life, but because I finally learned to use the power you helped me build to protect the principles you taught me. Her phone rang with the distinctive tone she had assigned to calls that required immediate attention, and she answered to find a young voice on the other end, nervous but determined in ways that reminded her of her own younger self when facing challenges that seemed insurmountable but necessary. Dr. Williams, the caller said, my name is Keisha Thompson. I'm a financial analyst in Atlanta, and something happened to me today that I think you would understand. Zara listened as Keisha described being denied access to a business meeting because security assumed she was in the wrong building, being questioned about her credentials by people who had never bothered to verify their assumptions, being told that perhaps she would be more comfortable in a different environment, where she wouldn't have to deal with situations that were clearly beyond her level of experience and expertise. "I've been following your story," Keisha continued, "and I wanted to ask for advice about whether I should file a complaint, whether I should accept the apology they offered after they realized their mistake, or whether I should use this experience to push for changes that would prevent other people from having to go through what I went through today." Zara's answer came from hard-won understanding of how individual moments of courage could create ripple effects that extended far beyond single incidents or personal vindication. "Keisha," she said, "your worth isn't determined by other people's comfort with your presence, and your response to discrimination should be based on what creates the most positive change for the most people, not just what makes you feel better in the moment." They talked for 20 minutes about accountability systems, documentation strategies, and the difference between seeking punishment for individuals and seeking transformation for institutions that had allowed discrimination to flourish because the people affected lacked the power to enforce consequences. Zara found herself articulating lessons she had learned not just from her own experience, but from Blake Morrison's transformation, from congressional testimony, and from conversations with people who had been fighting these battles long before her airplane encounter made headlines. After the call ended, Zara remained at her mother's grave thinking about legacy responsibility and the ways that privilege created obligations to use power in service of principles rather than personal advancement. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and when she opened it, she found a photograph of a young Latina woman confidently boarding an airplane, her first-class boarding pass visible in her steady hand, her expression radiating the quiet dignity of someone who knew she belonged exactly where she was. "Dr. Williams." The message read, "Thank you for making it easier for the rest of us to claim our seats without having to prove we deserve them." Zara smiled, understanding that real change happened not through single dramatic confrontations, but through countless individual moments when people chose courage over comfort, principle over convenience, and justice over the path of least resistance. As she drove away from the cemetery, Zara thought about Blake Morrison in his Queen's apartment, writing letters that acknowledged harm without seeking absolution, and about Keisha Thompson in Atlanta, deciding how to respond to discrimination with wisdom rather than just anger. The work continued, one conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one person at a time, choosing to treat dignity as something that couldn't be granted or taken away, but only recognized and respected as the fundamental right of every human being to exist in the world without having to justify their presence to people who had never earned the authority to question their worth. Change, Zara realized, didn't happen through perfect moments of justice, but through imperfect people making better choices than they had made before learning from consequences and using their experience to create opportunities for others to succeed, without having to endure the discrimination that had once been considered normal, acceptable, and inevitable. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts about how standing up for dignity has changed your own perspective. Together, we can build understanding one courageous choice at a time.